In 1969, a 13-year-old dropout on the south side of Chicago merged two rival street gangs into a single organization. Within 5 years, he controlled every corner from 39th Street to 120th. By the time he was 22, he had been sentenced to 150 to 200 years in prison for ordering a murder. It did not matter, not even slightly. From behind the walls of Stateville Correctional Center, he restructured that organization into something the federal government had never seen before: a board of directors, governors, regents, coordinators, foot soldiers, a corporate hierarchy managing 3,000 members across 35 states. Annual revenue, according to federal prosecutors, $100 million a year, in cocaine, in heroin, all of it directed from a prison cell in downstate Illinois. But then he did something even more dangerous than selling narcotics. He told his 3,000 soldiers to put down the guns and pick up voter registration cards. He created a political action committee called 21st Century VOTE. He marched 5,000 gang members to Chicago City Hall in broad daylight. He got a former gang war counselor into the White House to sit down with the President of the United States. He launched nonprofits, organized peace summits, and rebranded the most violent street gang in America as a community empowerment organization. His name was Larry Hoover, and the story of how a kid from Jackson, Mississippi turned the Gangster Disciples into the most powerful, most dangerous, and most contradictory street organization in American history is the one story that nobody in power ever wanted you to hear. So who was Larry Hoover? To understand what he built, you have to understand where he came from, because this was not a man who inherited power. This was a man who constructed it from absolute zero, in a place that was specifically designed to give him nothing and keep him there. Larry Hoover was born on November 30th, 1950, in Jackson, Mississippi. His father, Floyd Hopkins, was a mechanic who fixed other people's cars for a living and never owned anything worth fixing himself. His mother, Obelle Cooper, worked whatever job she could find, washing dishes in restaurants, folding clothes at laundromats, taking odd work wherever someone would pay her. Larry was the eldest of 4 children. When he was 4 years old, his mother packed up the kids and moved north to Chicago, part of that great current called the Great Migration that carried millions of black families out of the Deep South and into northern cities that had promised them better lives and delivered almost nothing. His father stayed behind in Jackson. The last time his parents spoke to each other was 1966. For all practical purposes, Larry Hoover grew up without a father, raised by a single mother on welfare in Englewood, one of the most neglected, most violent, most forgotten neighborhoods on Chicago's entire South Side. The streets of Englewood in the late 1950s were not complicated. They were poor, they were dangerous, and they were invisible. The city of Chicago poured its money into downtown, into the Loop, into the Gold Coast and the North Side, and left the South Side to figure itself out. There were no after-school programs. There were no job training centers. There were no recreational facilities that a kid could walk to after school. There were men on every corner who had given up looking for work, and boys on every block who had never seen a man go to one. Larry Hoover was one of those boys. He cleaned furnaces in apartment buildings for pocket change. He carried groceries for tips. He sold copies of Jet magazine on the elevated train platforms, riding the L through a city that did not know his name and did not care to learn it. And he watched. He watched the hustlers in pressed suits and polished shoes who seemed to have what no one else on his block possessed: money, respect, fear, and the undivided attention of everyone in the room. By the time he was 12, Hoover had joined a crew of about 30 neighborhood kids who called themselves the Supreme Gangsters. They rode the L together. They ditched school together. They mugged people and ran petty theft operations on passengers and pedestrians. It was small-time crime in a big city. But what was not small-time was the kid who was organizing it. Even at 12, Larry Hoover was different from every other boy on that block. He was quiet, almost introverted. He stuttered when he spoke, and other kids taunted him for it. But he had a quality that made every older hustler in Englewood stop and pay attention. He could organize people. He could make 15-year-olds twice his size fall in line without raising his voice. He could walk into a room full of chaos and within minutes have every person in that room doing exactly what he wanted them to do. When the Supreme Gangster's original leader, Alex Rain, was murdered in 1964, there was no debate, no election, no power struggle. Larry Hoover was 14 years old, and the South Side of Chicago had just met the man who would reshape its future for the next half-century. This is what made Larry Hoover different from every other gang leader in Chicago history. He did not think like a gangster. He thought like a CEO. In 1969, at the age of 18, Hoover did something that no one on the South Side had ever attempted. He brokered a merger between enemies. His Supreme Gangsters, roughly 5,000 members strong, combined forces with David Barksdale's Black Disciple Nation, which had close to 1,000 members. These two organizations had been shooting at each other for years, and an 18-year-old with a stutter sat them all down and unified them under a single banner, the Black Gangster Disciple Nation. Barksdale became the king, Hoover became the chairman, and Chicago's entire underground economy would never be the same. Think about what that means. An 18-year-old dropout with no formal education, no business training, no mentors in any boardroom anywhere in America, negotiated a corporate merger that unified 15,000 soldiers under a single command structure. Fortune 500 executives with Harvard MBAs and teams of lawyers have failed at mergers smaller than that. When David Barksdale died of kidney failure in 1974, complications from a shooting 4 years earlier, Hoover took sole command, and from that point forward he began constructing something the American criminal justice system had never encountered and was not remotely prepared to handle. He restructured the entire organization using corporate language that would have been right at home in any Wall Street boardroom or Silicon Valley startup. He named himself chairman of the board. He created 2 boards of directors, one for members operating on the streets, one for members incarcerated in prisons across the state. Below the boards, he appointed governors, each one responsible for managing drug distribution across a specific geographic territory, typically overseeing about 1,000 soldiers. Below the governors, he installed regents, who supplied product and managed individual selling locations they called spots. Below the regents, coordinators who collected revenue from each spot on an hourly basis. And at the bottom of this supply chain, foot soldiers, thousands of them, the street-level sales force that moved the branded product hand to hand, corner to corner, block to block. The distribution network was airtight. Product flowed down through the hierarchy. Revenue flowed up. Every foot soldier paid weekly dues, called the count or the weekly, essentially a franchise fee for the privilege of selling under the Gangster Disciples brand. Coordinators collected from soldiers, regents collected from coordinators, governors collected from regents and reported to the board. The board answered to one man, the chairman. If the organization caught an unaffiliated dealer selling on GD territory, they did not chase him off. They taxed him. These independent operators were called neutrons, and they paid a street tax for the right to operate. Any rival gang that attempted to sell in Gangster Disciples territory was dealt with through violence. This was not a gang. This was a franchise operation with an enforcement division. The weekly payroll was enormous. The branded product was cocaine and heroin, and the annual revenue, according to federal prosecutors who would later spend 8 years trying to prove it, was $100 million a year. Think about that number, $100 million. That was more annual revenue than Barnes & Noble generated in the same era, more than Mutual of Omaha. A street organization from the South Side of Chicago was out-earning publicly traded American corporations, and the entire enterprise was being directed by a single man sitting in a prison cell in downstate Illinois, communicating through face-to-face meetings because he knew the phones were tapped. Here is the detail that separates Larry Hoover from every other drug kingpin in American history. He was not free. He had been locked up since 1973. Convicted of ordering the murder of 19-year-old William Pookie Young, a neighborhood dealer accused of stealing drugs and money from the organization. Young was abducted and shot dead in an alley near 68th Street and Union Avenue in Englewood. Hoover was sentenced to 150 to 200 years, and it did not slow him down for a single day. From inside Stateville Correctional Center, and later from Dixon Correctional Center in downstate Illinois, Hoover ran the Gangster Disciples with more discipline and precision than most Fortune 500 CEOs run their companies from corner offices with glass walls and panoramic views. He knew the prison phones were monitored, so whenever a board member mentioned business during a phone call, Hoover would cut them off mid-sentence. "Come see me." That was the only instruction. Directors had to drive to whatever prison Hoover was housed in, sit across from him in the visiting room wearing their visitors' badges, and receive their orders face to face. No paper trail, no digital evidence, no wire, just two men talking, and 3,000 soldiers on the streets of Chicago and 34 other states executing whatever the chairman decided. The money came fast, and Larry Hoover spent it like he was afraid it would disappear. Picture the scene. It is the early 1990s. Larry Hoover has been transferred to the minimum security Dixon Correctional Center in Dixon, Illinois, roughly 100 miles west of Chicago. He is technically a prisoner serving a 150 to 200-year sentence for murder. He is functionally a king. Inside that facility, Hoover is wearing new clothes delivered by visitors who treat their prison appointments like courier runs. He is eating specially prepared meals brought in from the outside, not cafeteria slop. He is receiving private visitations from friends, family members, and the senior leadership of a national criminal organization in rooms that function as executive conference suites. He is wearing expensive jewelry. He is conducting meetings that determine the flow of cocaine and heroin into neighborhoods across 35 states. Outside the prison walls, the empire he built has metastasized into something unprecedented. The Gangster Disciples have expanded from a South Side Chicago street gang into a national syndicate with chapters from the Midwest to the East Coast to the Deep South. On the streets of Chicago, his soldiers wear Georgetown University sweatshirts that say Hoyas across the front, because in Gangster Disciples language, Hoya stands for Hoover's on your ass. That is not a fashion choice. That is a declaration of loyalty, so absolute it rewrites the meaning of a college logo. GD members hold weekly literature classes where they study Hoover's teachings from a 42-page constitution he personally authored by hand. New recruits are inducted with blood oaths and recitations from a creed that begins, "We are a special group of people with integrity and dignity." Veteran members describe Hoover in religious terms. A criminologist at Chicago State University who studied the organization observed that the Gangster Disciples taught their members. Hoover was a godlike figure with spiritual powers. Members paid regular dues. They paid special assessments called the political, which funded candidates friendly to the organization. Leaders regularly collected hundreds of thousands of dollars in street taxes every single day. Think about what that means. A man locked in a cage, in a facility run by the state, had become more powerful, more feared, and more worshipped than most men who walk free in the United States of America. But here is what Larry Hoover did not know. The very thing he built to make himself look legitimate was giving the federal government every piece of evidence it needed to bury him forever. Here is the contradiction at the center of this entire story. And you need to hold it in your mind for everything that comes next. Because Larry Hoover was not just running a drug empire, he was building a political movement, and the question of which one was real and which one was the mask is a question that Chicago still cannot answer. By the early 1990s, Hoover announced publicly that the Gangster Disciples were transforming. The letters GD no longer stood for Gangster Disciples. They stood for growth and development. He ordered his 3,000 members to go back to school. He made education mandatory for all soldiers in the organization. He instructed his army to learn trades, develop talents, and become stronger in society. And then he backed it up with infrastructure. The organization created nonprofit groups that ran voter registration drives across the South Side. They launched a music label that funded children's programs. They organized neighborhood cleanups, sweeping the same blocks where their foot soldiers had been selling crack the night before. They ran midnight basketball leagues in the Robert Taylor homes and other public housing projects. They gave away hundreds of bags of groceries to poor families, Cornish hens, macaroni and cheese dinners, boxes of stovetop stuffing, distributed on street corners where the same organization was simultaneously running an open-air drug market. And then came 21st century VOTE Voices of Total Empowerment, a political action committee created under Hoover's direct guidance from inside prison. This was not some half-hearted community gesture designed to look good in a parole hearing. This was organized political power on a scale that Chicago had not seen from any grassroots organization in decades, let alone a street gang. 21st century VOTE registered thousands of new voters across the South Side. They organized large-scale rallies in support of healthcare reform. They conducted gang peace summits that brought rivals to the same table. They marched on Chicago City Hall, as many as 5,000 strong, demanding funding for public schools and health clinics. Politicians of every background, black and white, liberal and conservative, lined up to court their influence because 21st century VOTE could deliver something every politician in Chicago craved: votes, money, and organized bodies in the street on Election Day. The group's officials included a convicted murderer, a man convicted of attempted murder, and a third ex-convict who police alleged had smuggled drugs into prison for Hoover himself. Wallace Gator Bradley, a self-described former Gangster Disciples war counselor who served as 21st century VOTE's public spokesman, ran for alderman twice in Chicago. He lost both times but forced a runoff in his second campaign. And in January 1994, Bradley walked into the White House alongside Jesse Jackson to speak with President Bill Clinton about combating crime in American cities. Think about that. A former gang war counselor in the West Wing, advising the President of the United States. Former Chicago Mayor Eugene Sawyer publicly supported Growth and Development's community work. Inner-city churches endorsed the organization. Public schools welcomed their volunteers. For a brief, extraordinary window, it appeared that Larry Hoover had accomplished the most audacious transformation in the history of American organized crime, converting 30,000 gang soldiers into a legitimate political machine. Hoover himself was inspired by a specific book, a biography of Chicago Mayor Richard J. Daley, written by Chicago Sun-Times columnist Mike Royko, titled Boss. The book described how Daley rose from the presidency of the Hamburg Athletic Club, a street-fighting Irish organization widely believed to have participated in the 1919 Chicago race riot, and climbed all the way to becoming the most powerful mayor in the history of the city. Hoover read that book inside his prison cell and saw his own blueprint written on every page. If Richard Daley could turn an Irish mob of brawlers into a political dynasty that ruled Chicago for decades, why couldn't a black man from Englewood do the same thing with 30,000 soldiers who would die for him? He said it out loud. On a track called A Visit with Larry Hoover, recorded for the Ghetto Boys' 1996 album, The Resurrection, Hoover spoke directly into the microphone from inside prison and declared that the mayor was scared of him. He launched a clothing line called Ghetto Prisoner. He was building a brand, a political identity, and a path to freedom, all from behind bars. But he was destroying the community with one hand and building it with the other. And the community loved him for it because nobody else was doing anything at all. The same corners where 21st century VOTE registered voters were the same corners where GD foot soldiers sold crack cocaine to their own neighbors. The same non-profit organizations that distributed groceries were, according to federal investigators, fronts for laundering drug money. The same midnight basketball leagues that kept teenagers alive after dark were funded by an enterprise that was putting heroin into the veins of their parents and older siblings. According to testimony from Gangster Disciples members who later cooperated with federal prosecutors, none of the proceeds from any of the organization's so-called charitable work actually went to helping anyone in need. And on secretly recorded tapes in 1993, even as Hoover spoke eloquently about the need to enlighten these young brothers and stop selling drugs, he was simultaneously implementing a new revenue scheme called Nation Dope, or 1 day a week. The policy was simple and brutal. Every drug dealer operating in Gangster Disciples territory had to dedicate 1 full day of profits each week to Hoover personally. He estimated it would generate $2,000 to $3,000 per week. And when someone on the tapes asked what would happen to dealers who refused, Hoover's answer was cold and final. They would be shot. 1 day a week ain't much to ask for your life. That was the chairman's arithmetic. That was growth and development in practice. He was the best thing and the worst thing that ever happened to the south side of Chicago, and every single person who lived there knew it. Now here is the part that most people don't know, the part that tells you everything about how this story ends. The thing that brought Larry Hoover down was not a drug bust on a street corner. It was not a rival gang member cutting a deal. It was not a routine traffic stop that turned up a trunk full of product. It was the very machinery of legitimacy he had spent years building. The reform, the politics, the meetings, the visitors. The federal government had been watching the entire transformation, and they were not impressed. They were taking notes. For 5 years, federal agents ran an undercover investigation that would become one of the most ambitious prosecutions of any criminal organization in American history. And the weapon they deployed was almost poetic in its irony. They embedded listening devices inside the visitors' badges at the prison, wafer-thin microphones hidden in the very credentials that Hoover's board members and lieutenants clipped to their shirts when they walked into the visiting room to receive the chairman's orders. The face-to-face meetings that Hoover had insisted on, the private conversations he demanded because he was too smart to discuss business on a monitored phone line, those meetings became the prosecution's entire case. Every order, every directive about territory, product, revenue, enforcement, and discipline, recorded, cataloged, transcribed. The thing that was supposed to protect him is what buried him. In April 1995, IRS agents seized 16 drawers of financial records from a Chicago concert promoter connected to the organization. Inside a folder marked LH, Senior Personal, they found a detailed computer printout that laid bare the entire Gangster Disciples hierarchy, leaders, territories, rival organizations labeled opposition forces. The corporation had maintained its own organizational chart, and the federal government had it in their hands. August 31st, 1995. Federal agents entered Dixon Correctional Center and removed Larry Hoover from his cell. Indicted. 39 defendants across 3 related federal cases: drug conspiracy, continuing criminal enterprise, extortion, money laundering. The charges spanned 2 decades. The evidence was devastating. The tapes, the financial records, the testimony of cooperating members who had flipped under the crushing weight of federal prosecution. One of the key cooperating witnesses was a GD officer named Charles Jello Banks, who mapped out the organization's entire secret structure in exchange for a reduced sentence. 2 boards of directors, governors, regents, enforcers, coordinators, the complete corporate blueprint, exposed by a man who had been sitting inside it for years. The trial lasted 8 weeks in a Chicago federal courtroom. The jury heard Larry Hoover's own voice on those tapes, recorded through visitors' badges he never knew were wired. They heard him boast about the 1-day-a-week scheme and its projected revenue. They heard him issue orders to governors like a chairman conducting a quarterly review. They heard him discuss territory and market share with the calm precision of a man running a board meeting. And they heard him use the soaring language of growth and development, the language of reform and community empowerment and political awakening, while simultaneously directing a narcotics distribution network that was destroying the same South Side neighborhoods he claimed to be saving. In May 1997, the jury came back. Guilty. All counts. All 40 of them. Conspiracy, extortion, money laundering, continuing criminal enterprise. The judge, in a moment that would define the case in every retelling, looked at Larry Hoover and told him that God had given him a gift, the ability to lead thousands of people, and that Hoover had squandered it. Then the judge gave him 6 additional life sentences. Federal. No possibility of parole. No possibility of communication. No possibility of running anything from anywhere ever again. The sentence meant something very specific. It meant Larry Hoover would be transferred from the state prison system in Illinois to the most restrictive federal facility in the United States of America, ADX Florence. the Supermax prison in Fremont County, Colorado. Poured concrete cells, 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. A window that is nothing more than a thin slit of glass pointed at the sky so inmates cannot determine where they are in the building. Furniture molded from concrete. Phone calls monitored and limited to a handful per month. The man who had run a $100 million annual enterprise from a prison visiting room was now locked in a box specifically designed to ensure that he would never speak a meaningful word to another human being again. The prosecutor, Ron Safer, later recalled the sound of the federal prison door closing behind Larry Hoover after sentencing. He said it clanged. He said he felt justice had been done, and he said there was no joy in it. The Gangster Disciples did not disappear after Hoover's federal conviction. They fractured. They splintered into competing factions. The corporate hierarchy that Hoover had built so meticulously could not survive without its chairman. Violence on the South Side escalated as rival factions fought for control of territory and revenue. The corners kept selling, the money kept moving, but the corporation had lost its CEO, and no successor had the authority, the vision, or the spiritual hold over 3,000 soldiers to keep the machine running as designed. Years later, a federal indictment unsealed in 2020 suggested Hoover had continued to communicate with the gang through coded messages hidden inside a dictionary found in his cell at ADX Florence. He denied it. The government said otherwise. The machine was broken. But the architect, even from inside the most isolated prison cell in America, might never have stopped trying to fix it. Here is the math of Larry Hoover's life. From Jackson, Mississippi to the chairmanship of a 30,000-member organization spanning 35 states. From selling Jet magazine on the L train for nickels to directing $100 million a year in narcotics revenue from a prison visiting room. From a welfare apartment in Englewood where his mother worked odd jobs at laundromats to a political action committee that put a former gang war counselor in the White House to advise the president. From growth and development to 6 life sentences at the most secure prison facility in the United States of America. And here is what makes this more than just a story about one man from the South Side. Larry Hoover grew up in a neighborhood where the city of Chicago had decided that black children did not need after-school programs, did not need functioning schools, did not need job training, did not need safe streets or recreational centers or any of the basic infrastructure that white neighborhoods on the North Side received without ever having to ask. He dropped out of school at 13 not because he was stupid, his school counselor called him a little above average, but because the school had already dropped out on him. He built a criminal organization because no legitimate institution in the city of Chicago would let him through the front door. He created a political machine because the political system had spent decades making sure that people who looked like him, who came from where he came from, had no power, no voice, and no seat at any table that mattered. And when he finally attempted to turn that organization into something the world might call legitimate, the same government that had abandoned his neighborhood for 40 years spent 5 years and millions of taxpayer dollars making absolutely certain he would never see daylight again. That says more about America than it says about Larry Hoover. In 2018, Kanye West pleaded Hoover's case to President Trump in the Oval Office. In 2021, Drake and Kanye headlined a free Larry Hoover benefit concert at the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. Rick Ross made his name a hook on one of the biggest rap singles of the decade. In May 2025, President Trump commuted Hoover's federal sentences, but Larry Hoover still sits in an Illinois state prison, transferred back to serve time for the murder he ordered in 1973 when he was 22 years old. He is 74 now. He has spent more than half a century behind bars. He says he has renounced the Gangster Disciples entirely and wants no part of the organization. The government points to coded messages and recent indictments that suggest otherwise. The chairman built a corporation, a political party, and a religion from a concrete cell. And the concrete cell is where America made sure he would stay.